loads of big talks after that. We're just being spoken to. Hang on a minute, from above. Wait a minute. Shall I carry on?
Yeah, please.
Okay. We're being recorded. Excellent. Yeah, so he would have known that he wouldn't give like loads of these big talks. I believe that's the same year he came here actually and gave a talk here, but I found talks only for the subsequent 2 years after that from him, and then after that he didn't speak in public again. And I think that was probably the last really big one that he gave. So I think it's really significant to dwell on what it was that he chose to speak about at that moment, in that situation. And what he chose to speak about was a sutta that the Buddha gave. It's towards the beginning of the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, so towards the last phase of the Buddha's life that's recorded. It's concerned with the factors that determine the longevity of a Sangha or a spiritual community, and what are going to cause that to flourish. I think there's an interesting parallel there, because the Buddha was giving that discourse to his monks towards the end of his own life. He would have been concerned with the fact that he wanted his Sangha to go on after he died. And I think it's interesting to reflect on, well, Bhante was in a similar point in his life where the spiritual community he set up, he knew that he'd already sort of stood back a lot from the responsibilities, but nevertheless, he was still there, alive, seeing it flourish, but he would have wanted that to continue after his death. So I think there's a really interesting parallel there between those two men. And I just want to start, before I go into the points themselves, by giving a bit of background to the sutta, because I think it's really interesting, the story. So the Buddha was quite old, and he was being fanned by Ananda. So Ananda, as you probably know, was his very good friend and personal attendant. So you can imagine the scene. And the Buddha had a visitor, and this visitor was a man named Vasakara. Vasakara was a very important man. He was the chief minister of King Ajatasattu, the king of Magadha. And Vasakara had come on a mission from the king. And basically what he wanted to say to the Buddha was, the king, Ajatasattu, wants to conquer and defeat their neighbours, the Vajjans. Will he win if he does? How's he going to get on if he does that? Which you might think is quite a bizarre question to ask the Buddha, but nevertheless, that is what he asked the Buddha. And the Buddha didn't directly answer Vasakara, but he turned to Ananda and said, Ananda, have you heard whether the Vajjans conduct their business, whether they meet regularly in large numbers? And Ananda said, well, yes, they do, Lord. Have you heard whether they conduct all their business in harmony? I believe they do, Lord, and so on. So he asked him 7 questions about the way that the Vajjans lived their lives and conducted their business together. And when Ananda answered in the affirmative for each one, the Buddha would say, well, that is going to conduce to the longevity of that society. These are the conditions for the stability of that society. And the Buddha said he had actually given those conditions to the Vajjans himself. And so at the end of these 7 points, Vasakara realized that unless they undermined these points, then they would never defeat the Vajjans. Following these 7 points made the Vajjans indefeatable. So off he went to tell the king that. And then the Buddha had a little think, and then he turned to Ananda and said, gather all the monks. I want to address the monks. So he gathered all the monks together, and then he gave a discourse to the monks. And the discourse to the monks was a bit longer. So there was actually 41 points in total that he gave to the monks about what they needed to do to preserve their Sangha. You will be relieved to know I'm not going to go through all 41 points today, but I am going to go through the first 7. So the first 7 reflect most closely the ones that he talked about the Vajjans. And these are the points that Bhante references in his talk. Also, I just want to say that the way that Bhante presents these points isn't necessarily what you'd expect if you just read the Pali. And you might be surprised to learn, because I'm giving the talk, that I'm not going to talk much about the Pali or really what the Buddha said. I'm going to find out, it's a shock. I'm going to focus on what Bhante said. And that's not because I don't think there's value in the Pali at all. But I think I want to focus on what Bhante said, because this is what he chose to communicate to us, his community, about what's important. So I think I want to focus on that. And if you want to do some study on the actual Pali, then let me know and I'll do a day about that instead. My notes at all yet? Okay, great. I will start to read them now. Okay, so the first point, I've written them here. I know it's very tiny, so I'll say what they are, and you can always, if you want to copy them down, you can always come and do that later. So the first one is gathering in large numbers. Okay. So the Buddha's first point is that to maintain and grow a Sangha, we need to actually come together. And the Buddha says regularly and in large numbers. So you could say that the coming together of us is Sangha. That is what Sangha is. It's what happens, it's what's created when fellow Dharma-farers come together. And Bhante has always been really clear that the Sangha is a network of spiritual friendships. It's a network of connections. So it's something that needs to be done. We do Sangha. We create Sangha. It's an activity. It's not a concept. And it needs to be lived out in what we do. So to form really deep and consistent friendships, that network of spiritual friendships, we need to come together. We need to be in the presence of one another to cultivate and maintain those connections. And without those friendships and connections, there isn't a Sangha. That's it. So I wonder if you could say, like, if the Sangha is a network of spiritual friendships, you could think of this point as saying, well, your first job is to show up to those friendships. Just show up, come to events, help to create a Sangha, which nourishes us, nourishes each other, and attracts other people to it so that it continues to flourish and grow. Over the last, couple of years, I mean, it's obviously been a lot harder to meet in large numbers and even in small numbers. And I don't know about you, but I've certainly noticed that taking its toll on me in relation to my connection with others and feeling a sense of being plugged in to the Sangha and something a bit bigger. I think there's something about being with people which puts me in touch, having somebody actually in front of me. I have a sense of their energy, their humanity. I just want to respond in a way it's very hard to do when I'm not with a person or even when I'm just Zooming with a person. It's a different thing, I think. And without that sort of empathy, that kind of responsiveness, without that compassion and understanding and forgiveness that flows from that, it's very, very difficult to have a Sangha, to have a network of friendships. I remember when I was able to come back to Sangha night for the first time, I'd forgotten what it was like, which is bizarre because I've been coming here for so many years, and to just be amongst my spiritual friends with the shared aspirations, just part of something bigger. I remember running up the stairs to meditate after the break, which I don't know if I've ever done that before, because I was so in touch with my motivation and my inspiration for teaching, because I was just picking up on the kind of vibes. So related to this, what I've just said, Pama Vajra makes the point when he says Bhante's always been really clear that meeting virtually isn't the same as meeting in person. And I definitely don't want to stand here and knock Zoom and the benefits of meeting cyberly, because obviously there are loads of benefits. We've all benefited from that, and we wouldn't have been able to be together in any way without that. And those of you who are able to be here today, awesome. So it's obviously really great and better than nothing. And I'm also wondering whether, if that was the only way that the Sangha could ever meet forever, whether that would work, like whether it would be possible to sustain the depth and connection that is needed for a spiritual community. I don't think it is. I think it would, after a while, just become more fragmented and superficial. And I think that's the point that the Buddha and Bhante are making here. These are the conditions for the deep flourishing of the Sangha, not just the kind of like plasters, which is, I think, sort of what we've been doing a little bit. Bhante also makes the point in his talk, which I think is very good, that some of us might not like crowds and might find the idea of gathering in large numbers rather off-putting. And, I think this isn't specific to certain individuals. I think all of us at some time will have thought, oh God, there's so many people, and, we might imagine coming to Sangha night and the tea room being like that chaos that it can be, and just thinking, oh, I'm not in the mood for that. So that's what might come to mind when you think of this point. And I think there's definitely a case for, well, actually, that's a really great place where we can come together and build connections and have interactions. And I really missed those sorts of casual interactions when we weren't able to have them. But at the same time, I don't necessarily think this is the sort of gathering that the Buddha had in mind when he made this point, and nor did Bhante, I think. You can't really imagine the monks kind of standing around with their tea, sort of chatting about their weeks, and in the kind of volume levels that we do. Probably would have had something to say about frivolous speech. But, you know, I think Bhante, when he talks about this point, mentions coming together to meditate, to do puja, to listen to talks, that sort of thing. And he makes the point that when we come together in those sorts of ways, in large numbers, it can have a really profound effect. It can really, a different level of consciousness can arise between us. And I had that sort of experience, I think, on my first big order gathering. I'd not been ordained all that long, and I went off to Wyndham to this big thing, sitting in this big gym, packed with order members, most of whom I'd never clapped eyes on before, feeling like the most new, weird person that shouldn't be there, surrounded by all these weird people that I didn't know, and just thinking, oh my God, what am I doing here? And at the same time, you know, then saluting the shrine with 500 other order members, all of whom have committed their lives to, you know, attaining enlightenment for the sake of all beings. I mean, that's massive. And I just remember thinking, God, we're all so weird, but how amazing that we all want this same thing, and just being really lit up by that. And I think that was partly to do with just the sheer numbers of people all there, like the energy all just driving in the same direction. So yeah, so if the connections that are these meeting in large numbers are, if they're built on shared practice, then we can be sure that the friendship and the connections that arise will be coming from on the basis of that Dharma practice. And so they'll be very, very deep and indeed and solid. Okay, harmony and tolerance is the second one. So the Buddha talks about how it's important to, when we come together, when we do the business of the Sangha, and when we part, that we remain in harmony. So when we come together and we do things and we leave, to try and maintain as much harmony as we can in that process. And it's not hard to understand why this is an important condition for the longevity of the Sangha. Because if we're not in harmony, then splits and schisms arise, people fall out, and then we don't have a cohesive body moving in the same direction. And I'm reminded of the, you know, the quarrel at Kasambi, where the monks fall out really badly, and there's a big split in the Sangha, and the Buddha can't even sort them out. And you know, that started, I believe, Savannah Garber will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it started over which side of the toilet to leave a water pot. Is that right? Something like that, something ridiculous like that. Yeah, so how to clean up after you use the toilet. So we can't really underestimate the terrible power of disharmony, what it can do to the Sangha, and what sort of small beginnings it can have if we don't resolve these small differences promptly, what terrible things can arise on the basis of it. But this doesn't mean that we're not going to agree. I think this is really the most important thing. Like, harmony does not mean that we're all going to agree. Of course, we're not going to agree. We're all very different in this Sangha. We've got lots of different views and lots of different ways of going about things. But that doesn't mean we can't remain in harmony. And Bhante gives the image of an orchestra and music, where you've got lots of different instruments all playing different things. And sometimes in music, there are those beautiful moments where there's a clash, which then resolves. So, that there can still be beauty, because in spite of the clashing, or maybe even because of the clashing, it takes the beauty to a new level or something. So Bhante says that it's possible to remain in harmony while disagreeing if we develop a deep feeling for each other, and the fact that we're all sort of in this together. Basically, we're trying to do the same thing. We're all standing side by side in this, members of the same project, viewing each other's with the eyes of friendship. And taking this a bit further, I should have said as well, I'm drawing quite heavily as well on a talk that Padmavajra gave in 2012, where he sort of a commentary on Bhante's talk. And in this talk, Padmavajra takes it a bit further and says that in order to remain in harmony, we all need to be referring up to something that's greater than us, something beyond ourselves. So we're not relating primarily in terms of ourselves, what we want, what's good for us, what we think we need. We're relating to each other in the Sangha from a bigger perspective, our shared commitment to our going for refuge, our common aspirations and our love for the Dharma and hopefully each other. And at the time of the Buddha, they had the Buddha. I mean, he was a really good reminder of that, and he was there. And Pamavajja says that after the Buddha died, they still kept a seat out for him. And he thinks that perhaps part of that was because, well, if you've got a seat there for the Buddha, you're imagining the Buddha there, you're not likely to start brawling with each other. And, you know, you're going to maintain the same standards you would if the Buddha was sitting there, because you've got a reminder of that higher spiritual ideal, like in front of you. So we don't have this, but we've got the shrine, which I suppose performs something of the same function. It puts us in touch with our ideals. It reminds us what's important and lifts us up beyond ourselves. I also think maybe this is one of the reasons it's so helpful to recite the refuges and precepts together when we come together, say at the beginning of mitra study or chapter meetings, which I know a lot of us do. And as the order and movement, we have this symbol of Avalokiteshvara, who is a beautiful image for that, where he's got all the different hands holding all the different things, quite disparate and diverse instruments, which are brought together by the bodhicitta held at his heart. So the common unifying goal, which allows everything to be brought together. So if we are maintaining this shared aspiration of moving, communicating from beyond ourselves, then we can retain harmony, because we're coalescing, we're coming together, referring to each other on that higher level. I'd like to give a personal example of this from a friendship in my life. So a very good friend of mine, and a lot of you will know, is Vajratara. And in 2009, Vajratara and me and Moksha had a ceremony where they became my Kalyana mitras, and we were bound together by a vow in front of the Buddha till death do us part, and they committed to supporting me throughout my spiritual journey, and I committed to friendship with them. And after a little while, a few years maybe, Vajratara and I hit a bit of a rocky patch in our friendship, which was entirely my fault, and our communication wasn't great for a while. And this went on a long time, and we were both, and it was quite painful for both of us, but there was a very, very strong desire on both sides to remain in harmony and to achieve harmony. And because we were both referring up to something higher, so our shared love for the Dharma, our vow that we'd taken to each other, and the loyalty to our friendship that we had. And we continued to go into, we didn't kind of ignore what had happened, we just continued to go back into it with this in mind. And by the end of that time, I think the friendship is now so strong, I don't know if anything could break it, because we were able to go really, really into the difference. So being in harmony really doesn't mean we can't have difference. It just really means referring back, continually referring back up to what it is that's most important for us. And I'll always be grateful to Vajratara for being with me on that journey and teaching me how possible it is to remain in harmony whilst being, you know, also in conflict, I suppose. The third point, I haven't got quite so much to say about all of them, so don't panic. So the third one, not changing accepted practice. So the word for practice is sikapada, which, as you'll surely know, is part of what we say when we do the precepts sikapadan. So the training principles that we take on. And so Bhante says in his talk that he doesn't think that the Buddha was saying here, you should never change anything that I've said, and you must always do everything exactly how I've taught. Because then the Buddha went on to say at some other points quite soon after that, and also after I've my parinirvana, you can change these rules if you want. And also throughout his life, he'd changed rules as according to the need of the Sangha and the situation. So Bhante thinks really that what the Buddha's getting at there is the need for the continuity of change, and for any changes that arise to arise out of the basis of what's gone before. So you could say evolution rather than revolution. And the evolution will be based on an awareness of the key underlying principles of those practices. So I was thinking of some examples of this, and I think what's happened here at the centre is a really interesting example of this. So, you know, we had the way things were before COVID, and then, you know, things had to change a bit, you know, the way things were done, the way classes were run, etc., had to be reevaluated because it wasn't possible to do them how they've been done. I'll be interested to see what of that remains going forward, because things have changed. Things won't, you know, magically return to how they were. We're living in a new world now. So it'd be interesting to see what remains of those changes. But I can see that the changes that have been made, and I imagine that the ones that continue to be made in the future will be around the principles that this Sangha is built on, which is the 4 Sangha Vastus. So generosity, affectionate speech, exemplification, and beneficial activity. So they've always been what the Sheffield Buddhist Centre has been based on. So I can imagine that whatever it looks like after, it will still look like that, if you see what I mean. So speaking like for our own personal practice, I think it behoves us to be very conscious of what our own principles are, if we're going to sort of tinker around with our own personal practice, in order to avoid unwittingly changing it in such a way that it goes along with our likes and our dislikes, rather than what actually is benefiting us spiritually. And Dharmamayi points to our precepts, so the precepts that we take as mitras and order members, and also the centrality of our going for refuge. And he says these are the things which are absolutely the bedrock and cannot be changed. And what these look like might change. And he makes the point that we can never really understand the depth and the scope of just these 2 aspects of our practice. So what it would mean, I think what that would look like, would be using those things as a kind of compass point or reference point for what we're doing with our practice. So I was thinking of like something like the mindfulness of breathing. And, you know, when we're taught that, we're always taught with the counting. And that's ever so useful for a lot of people, especially when we're new to meditation and our mind is just like blah, all over the place. Very, very helpful to have something to pin it on. And then some of us might not find that helpful, or some of us over time might decide we're going to try something else, maybe going to drop the counting. But the principle is the importance of the development of mindfulness and our awareness in meditation. So we maintain that principle, even though the practice might start to look a little bit different. The principle has not changed. But then I suppose what we need to do is we need to be honest with ourselves. We need to go back and assess, well, actually, is me dropping the counting actually helping the development of my mindfulness? Or do I just not really want to bother with the counting, and be honest about whether that is helping us? And if it is, if it's actually in line with the principle of development of mindfulness, which is the thing that can't be changed. There's always a danger of throwing practices out completely because we don't like them. And usually if we're having a big reaction to something, it's coming from our own lack of understanding or our superficiality of our understanding of the thing that we're reacting to. That's the point Dharmamayi makes, and I fully agree with him in relation to my own reactivity. Some of you who I've known for longer will remember my enormous levels of reactivity to Green Tara, who I hated with a passion when I first came across her. Which was entirely to do with my own fear of receiving kindness. And I also had an enormous reaction to the bodhicitta, which had to do with my own anti-God issues. It just sounded like a cloud of God to me, the way people would describe it, and it just really put me off. And that was due to my limited understanding of the bodhicitta and my own literalism. So I'm sure you've all got loads of your own examples of reacting to stuff, which is just because what we're doing is we're taking our own conditioning and our limited worldly understanding and plonking them onto Dharma context without really kind of going into it and questioning that. Be interesting maybe to share in your groups what you've reacted to and how that's resolved itself, or not maybe. Okay, question number 4, respect for spiritual elders. So this is a point that the Buddha's making about spiritual hierarchy. So I just want to really, really emphasize this has absolutely nothing to do with authority or status. So you can just really banish those concepts from your mind. And really wise people who we would be looking up to would be unconcerned with those things anyway. This point is about recognizing that there will be people within the Sangha who are wiser and more experienced than we are, and about training ourselves to be receptive to those people and the wisdom that we could receive from them and how they could help us, how we can learn from them. Often those people have been around longer than us. This isn't to say we can't also learn stuff from younger and less experienced people, because obviously we can. But personally, I think I always benefit from my conversations with people like Amoghavamsa, Pamavajra and Punyamala, who've been around a long time, have a lot of experience, very, very embedded in the Dharma. And even just from being with them, I feel like I'm kind of being reset into a slightly bigger and more Dharmic perspective. And this doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to agree with every word that they say, but I do take what they say very, sorry, but I do take what they say very, very seriously, because it's coming from them and they're sort of substantial beings. So I think it's worth really listening to what they have to say. For a Tibetan Buddhist, the guru or the teacher is like treated like the Buddha, and is the Buddha refuge for them. Might not be enlightened, but it's the nearest that we've got. So, you know, we want to really use that. We really kind of draw on that as much as we can. Bhante makes the point that these people may not be the loudest or most well-known people, you know, these people who have got this deep practice. They might be just quietly getting on with their practice somewhere without a big fanfare. So I think it's important to think of this point as about developing receptivity to wisdom and experience wherever we encounter it, even if we're not expecting to. Okay, safeguarding our spiritual vision, number 5. So the Buddha, when he talks about this in the Sutta, talks about the importance of not falling under the sway of craving that leads to rebecoming. So Bhante puts this in terms of not falling into the gravitational pull of the mundane, or backsliding. And I really like the way he puts it. He sort of evokes, you know, you come along, you're full of enthusiasm, you're really, you know, excited about the Dharma, you're really inspired, really stuck into your practice. And then, you know, gradually things might change, you know, you might get some more responsibilities, something at work might change, you know, gradually, we lose touch with our original energy, our original inspiration, our original motivation. And we start to slightly settle for what's a bit comfier, what's a bit easier. Maybe we stop challenging ourselves quite so much. And our craving just locks on to something else, which is a bit easier. We get distracted from our Dharma focus, and our focus might become something else, which is pulling us off in a different direction. And he says that if this happens for enough people in the Sangha will decay. The Sangha depends on people really going for refuge. And if we start not really going for refuge, well, the Sangha won't really, you know, it won't be there. So the point here is to safeguard our original spiritual vision so that we can keep our motivation alive and our practice remains vibrant and engaged. And it's so easy to let our desire pull us off course, because the pull of the mundane is strong. It's stronger than the pull of the transcendental, but until the point which we are stream entrants, that's just how it is. And unless we make some effort to pull against the stream, we're just going to be carried along towards, you know, back the way we came, basically. And the Dharma life is hopefully full of joy and freedom and love, but also it can be challenging. It requires effort and isn't always the easiest option, you know, to put your hand in the wheel of samsara and try and stop it. It can be very, very uncomfortable, and we don't always fancy it. So, yeah. So because it's such a big deal, like doing it by an effort of will just doesn't work. So this is the main point, really. It's too great an undertaking what we're trying to do to just do it by an effort of will. Something like that needs to involve the whole of our being, the whole of our hearts. If we're only doing it with part of ourselves, then after the while, the rest of us will just kind of drag us off and we'll get lost. And so it won't work as a long-term strategy. And as a very willful person who tried this out, I can fully endorse the fact that it doesn't work. So I think this is probably why Bhante stressed integration as such an crucial initial part of our spiritual lives. So for it to work, we need to engage our desire. We need to really get our desire behind our practice, behind Buddhism. What is it why are we here? Like, what do we love about what we're doing here? And really be in touch with that. I really loved a talk that I heard Bhante give at some point recently, where he said he was talking about desire, and somebody had said to him about getting rid of desire, going beyond desire. And he said, well, don't really think of it in terms of that, going beyond desire. Think of it in terms of transferring your desire for the mundane and the conditioned to a desire for the transcendental, for the unconditioned. We need our desire. We just want it to be going in the right direction. So we need to be in touch with what about the Dharma life excites us and inspires us. And really try and make sure we're doing that, which will take effort. So it might be really interesting in our groups to talk about where we find life, where we find beauty in our Dharma lives. Pama Raja uses the phrase, how does enlightenment communicate to us? So that's a really interesting thing. And it will be so different for all of us. We're all so different. For me, giving talks is a massive part of what keeps me engaged, but that's very specific to me, for example. Okay, number 6. Let me just have Okay, wholehearted intensity of practice. So this is interesting. The Buddha talks about cherishing the forest depths in this point. So that would have been a reference to when the monks went off to have their retreats in the forest depths, which were pretty intense. I mean, it wasn't like going on retreat here where we've got, people cooking for us and stuff. I mean, you've got wild animals who might kill you, and dark and frighteningness. So yeah, big deal doing that. So when Bhante talks about this, interestingly, he draws out the importance of there being full-timers. So the importance of people in the Sangha who devote the whole of themselves to practice in whatever form that looks like. So people who are wholeheartedly devoted to maintaining the health of the spiritual community. So these might be people who are working for the Dharma full-time, or people who are just quietly getting on with their practice in a very intense and full-time sort of a way. So for example, here we've got the centre team who that's their livelihood, their job. They give the whole of themselves to that project. And we've got the retreat teams who do that across the world and across the UK. People who work in right livelihoods, and other people who work for the movement and order across the world. I mean, there are so many people involved. You wouldn't believe how many people are involved. There are also people who I know here in Sheffield, some of them are here, who have chosen not to work so much so that they can devote themselves to the deepening of their practice, which is really, really crucial too. So these sorts of activities create a core of deep practice and commitment for the movement and order, which then radiates out and benefits all of us. So we all need this activity. Without this core of activity, the Sangha wouldn't exist, it wouldn't flourish. It keeps it deep for the rest of us, basically. And practically speaking as well, without people doing this, it just wouldn't work. Like, there's so much organisation involved, just even running one centre, never mind an entire movement, that if people didn't give their lives to it, we wouldn't have the centre, we wouldn't have the order. So it's in all of our interests to make it viable for such people to exist within our Sangha. And there's loads of ways we can do this. I mean, most of us do this already financially, with our standing orders. We do this by coming to events, by helping out. even just by expressing gratitude, actually, I think can be massive, because it can feel a bit, I mean, I worked on the centre team for some years, and it can feel a bit thankless sometimes because it's so hard. And, you know, when somebody comes back to you and says, thanks, that was a really great puja, I really enjoyed it, it really, really makes a big, you know, so never underestimate the power of a thank you. And when he talks about this, Padmabhadra particularly he opens up the general importance of service, service to the Sangha. And I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it, that in terms of growing and maintaining a Sangha and flourishing, a Sangha whose members are much more concerned with what they can give and do is going to really, really flourish more than a Sangha whose members are concerned with what they can take. And we, as those people, will also flourish more if we have that attitude of wanting to serve. And there are so many ways we can serve the Sangha. We come to things, we're friendly, we help out, we respond. When I first started coming to the centre, it was a lot smaller, the Sangha, and I think people did help out more, because I think as something gets bigger, there's an assumption that someone else is going to do it. It's just natural, you know, I'm not giving us a hard time about it, but it's a natural thing, but we can't assume that. Like, we're the Sangha, we have to take responsibility for doing those things, like Shantachara was saying, like filling the dishwasher and, you know, supporting classes. Without that, they won't happen, there won't be a Sangha. It's up to us. So we might not be able to be full-time, but Padmabhadra says, be as full-time as you can. So I like that. So finally, welcoming people to the Sangha. So when the Buddha makes this point, he talks about the importance of mindfulness for maintaining a community that people can join in the future. And Bante's sort of spin on this is that we need to be careful to avoid the Sangha becoming a clique or a group or a kind of inward-facing sort of community. And I think we're good at this in Sheffield, but there's always room for improvement, especially I think at this point in time. It's a very, very timely point, because we're coming together perhaps for the first time in a long time to make connections again. And it's so easy just to give ourselves over to the pleasure of that, of seeing somebody we've not seen for so long, and just getting really absorbed and maybe even a bit intoxicated by that, and losing awareness of what's going on around us, of the people who might be newer, might not know people. You know, they might need us just to sort of acknowledge their existence and offer them a cup of tea. So easy to lose awareness of that. And yeah, even the smallest act of kindness can have profound effects. And I remember when I first came to the centre, I mean, I'm not terribly shy as a person, but still, you know, what I remember from that course was the people who made me feel welcome. And I don't know without that how it would have gone, you know. I remember who they were, you know, even though it was so long ago, particularly Becky Shashelsky. Anyone remember Becky? She was so welcoming. Vajratara asking me about my day. You know, these things have stayed with me, like, God, how many years? 16 years or something. And I've had feedback from people who said to me that my interest in them was very key for their continuing in the Sangha. And, you know, I can't always even remember it. For me, it's me just being friendly to this person, but to them, it makes all the difference. So particularly as a mitra and order Sangha, we really need to be cultivating amongst us this awareness of outward facingness and mindfulness of those other people who could be part of that, drawing people into the network of our friendships. I was in the shops yesterday, and I like to always buy something for the food bank, but I can easily forget to do that because I'm basically self-centered and absorbed in my own needs and what I want. And if there's not a trolley there in front of me when I walk in, often I'll forget. So I think we need to be each other's trolley. Like, we're all going to forget from now on that, you know, from now and then we're going to be like, oh, I've not seen you for 2 years, and we're going to be like that. And it's a joint effort really to make the Sangha a place where everyone always feels welcomed and drawn in and not left out. So these are the 7 points. I hope that there's something in there that you want to maybe, while you're getting your tea, think about stuff you might want to take into your groups to discuss. And I just want to conclude with a more general point, which struck me, which is that, well, the Sangha is a conditioned thing. It's not, we can't take it for granted. It's going to endlessly continue. And I just think it's worth bearing that in mind, because it can be so easy, especially when something's got big and it's going really well, just to assume that's always going to be like that. But I mean, if nothing else, COVID has shown us that that's not the case, and that things can just get at the drop of a hat. That, you know, one thing changes, everything changes. The appendix to the story I was telling earlier is that the Vajrayans were defeated because the Vasakara went back to the king and said, well, they're all living in harmony and doing all these things the Buddha said, so they can't be defeated. So what they did was they sent spies in to get everyone to fight each other and fall out, and so dissent amongst the tribes, and then they were easy pickings. So, and the Vajrayans were very, very strong and harmonious community by all accounts. So if it could happen to the Vajrayans, it can happen to anybody. So it's really worth, I think, bearing in mind these points and really taking on what Bhante told us and highlighted for us, because then, in the words of the Buddha, we can expect the growth of the Sangha and not its decline. Thank you very much. Thanks. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go and get a cup of tea and then take that tea immediately, because I mean, that alone will take a long time. Take that then straight into groups. The groups will take place in these 4 locations. The garage, does that have a special name?
Gazebo.
The garage gazebo, the squirrel grove, the tea station, that's not very exciting. Tea station, there's one there, and the patio palace. So go to one of those places. Is there only 4 spaces?
No, the patio palace has got 3.
Okay, so there are 3 in the patio palace, so that makes quite a lot of spaces. So if you go to one of those spaces with your tea, and if there's too many people, you'll be moved along. So you might expect that. So if you're particularly wedded to going to one of those places, maybe get a move on. And do the group leaders know who they are and where they're going?
Just no, it's just like Sangha night. So
but the group leaders at Sangha night know where they're going, don't they?
Well, we can ask them now.
Maybe if the group leaders could just hang on for a minute when everyone else has gone, and we'll just put you somewhere.
That's fine.
And those of you on Zoom, Vicky will do something magical with you. So enjoy your groups. And the groups will end about 2:45, 10 to 1 or something like that. 1:45. Okay, great. Enjoy your groups.
Will we have a bell?
Yes. Yeah, we'll have a bell when the groups finish.
Yeah, that's fine.
What do you think, really?
Always better once to start talking.
Yes.